Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody. Last month we did a show with the distinguished cultural historian Paul Elie on art, faith, and sex in the 1980s. His new book, The Last Supper, Art, Faith, Sex, and Controversy in the 1980s, has been extremely well reviewed. The book focuses on what he describes as the crypto-religiosity of many of the leading cultural figures of the 1980s, including in terms of musical artists, Leonard Cohen, Prince, Patti Smith, even Bruce Springsteen. But I wonder whether all the great artists of the 1980s were as crypto-religious as Elie suggests in his book. It's a brilliant book. Take, for example, Talking Heads, a very prominent band formed in 1975, enormously influential in the 1980s. I wonder whether they were crypto-religious. That's a question for the biographer of Talking Heads, my guest today, Jonathan Gould, whose new book, Burning Down the House, Talking Heads and the New York Scene That Transformed Rock, is out this week. And Jonathan is joining us from Livingston in New York. He operates in that well-trod corridor between Hudson, upstate New York, the Hudson Valley, and Brooklyn. Jonathan, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Paul's book, The Last Supper, but I'm sure you're familiar with his notion of crypto-religiosity. Were Talking Heads a religious band, or did they never seem to take anything particularly seriously? Would they be the kind of band that would have taken God seriously?
Well, not so much, I would say. Certainly not the way U2 perhaps, or took God seriously, or the way I'm not, I haven't read Paul's book. I know Paul very slightly. He was almost an editor of mine at Farrar, Straus, Giroux. But I've sort of followed his work over the years. But I imagine what he's talking about has to do with a certain strain of sensibility in the 1980s that took off of a kind of probably mainly Christian, although Leonard Cohen is in there, a certain religiosity, let's say. And no, I would say Talking Heads were the most agnostic of bands in many ways. Not atheistic, but agnostic is the way I would describe it anyway.
Yeah, that's a nice way of putting it. A good dose of agnosticism. So set the scene for us. And Dylan, of course, is in the book too, The Christian Period, which works very well for Elie. A few years ago, we did a show with the political writer Ron Brownstein, who at the time he has a really good book out. I'm sure you've heard of it. Rock Me the Water, 1974, the year Los Angeles transformed movies, music, television, and politics. He makes the case that all the cultural action, all the good music and movies and everything else, the art, was in Los Angeles. You're not making the alternative argument. I know yours is not necessarily a book about New York. It's a book about Talking Heads. But you are making an argument about the scene, the New York scene in the 70s. Tell me about it, and how did Talking Heads come out of that scene?
Well, the main thing I would say about that is this: the late 1970s, particularly from 1975 on, which is when Talking Heads, the members of Talking Heads arrived in New York City, was a very dramatic period in the history of New York. As many people remember or know, New York in that period was teetering on the brink of bankruptcy.
What's the famous newspaper headline, the Ford headline to New York? New York dropped dead.
It was a Daily News headline, and it was Ford to City drop dead. And what it referred to was Gerald Ford, who was preparing to run for president, initially preparing to run for the Republican nomination against Ronald Reagan, who was an arch conservative from California.
Haven't heard of him. He's a marginal figure, Jonathan, in American history, right?
He comes into this story later.
He's in every story in the 80s, of course.
Yes, it is. Yes, he is. But Ford was trying to position himself as much of a conservative as possible. And the drop dead referred to any proposition or any possibility that the federal government would bail out New York City with some kind of loan or loan guarantee or something like that. Of course, the federal government went on to do exactly that. The headline was a bit of a ruse, but it wasn't enough to prevent Jimmy Carter from winning the 1976 election the next year. With the help of New York's, at that time, I don't know if it was the largest electoral vote, but certainly next to California, it was the largest electoral vote. So that whole episode kind of cost Gerald Ford the Republican nomination. And in terms of what it cost the rest of us, since if Ford rather than Reagan Ford rather than Carter had won the election that year, we probably never would have had Ronald Reagan as our president in the 1980s. But anyway, getting back to New York,
we still would have got the talking heads, though, wouldn't we?
We still would have had the talking heads, exactly. And I think the things that I would like to emphasize about New York in that period is something that people today would probably find completely unimaginable about it, which is it was one of the most affordable big cities in America at that time. When David Byrne and Tina Weymouth and Chris Franz moved to New York in 1975 and eventually wound up renting a loft on Christie Street in Lower Manhattan, I think their rent was something in the order of $275 or maybe $300 a month for the three of them. That's kind of unimaginable in today's world. But the reason for this was the city was draining population. It lost about 1 million residents between 1970 and 1980, and it was draining jobs as well. All of Lower Manhattan, which had once been a huge manufacturing center since the 19th century, was turning into something very different from that. And all of this formal sort of industrial space was suddenly up for grabs. And the importance of this was that young people could move to New York in the 1970s and afford to live there and pursue their dreams. Now, people have been doing that for a very long time, and people are still doing that to some extent today. But there was a moment there where there was a kind of economic cushion that people had that created a remarkable scene. And the other thing I'd say about that remarkable scene is that it was happening in a part of New York that had not been associated with culture in some ways ever, or at least for a very long time. When people thought of culture in New York City in the 1970s, they thought of the museums and on the Upper East Side or Uptown. They thought of the literary haunts like the Algonquin Hotel and places like that in Midtown, and they thought of the Village. What they didn't think of was the whole world that was developing below 14th Street, particularly on the East Side and below Houston Street, all over the city, or on both sides of the city, rather, which we now think of course, as some of the most famous neighborhoods in New York, Soho and Tribeca and places like that. So there was this enormous shift in the social geography of the city, and that in many ways made possible what happened down there, culturally speaking.
Jonathan, I mentioned this before we went live. We did a show a few months ago with your friend Seth Rogovoy. I know you're doing a reading with him, very distinguished music writer, journalist. We did a show on the Dylan biopic. He wasn't a big fan, but that did that take place in the early 60s? That was in the Village, and
Very
you're
much.
distinguishing between the Village and what neighborhoods now we're talking about? The Bowery, Chelsea? What
Well,
neighborhoods
yeah,
would?
what we're talking, I mean, in terms of, and again, when people referred to the Village in those days, where that was Dylan's haunt, they were speaking mainly of what we now call the West Village, which was the sort of gentrified area, gentrified section of the village. The neighborhoods we're talking about mainly were what became known as Soho, south of Houston Street, Tribeca, which is it was an acronym for a triangle of land below Canal Street, but very importantly, what's known generally as the East Village, which sort of begins around the Bowery or maybe Broadway and stretches east, again in Lower Manhattan. And the East Village in those days that we're talking about in the 1970s it had been many things. It had been a Jewish ghetto during up until about the 1940s or up until World War II. It was the famous Jewish Lower East Side, as it was referred to, and then that slowly but largely became a substantially, in terms of residencies, a substantially Latino neighborhood. And by the time Talking Heads moved to the Bowery, or actually Christie Street, which is one block over from the Bowery, in 1975, there was a park that runs along Christie Street for about 7 blocks, and it's named after. It was created in the 1930s, and it's named after Sarah Roosevelt, who was Franklin Roosevelt's mother, and it had become largely what we would call sort of a drug den. Essentially, it was ruled by Latino street gangs. There was also a very after dark. There was a very significant sex trade operation going on there because of the crosstown traffic on Houston and Delancey streets. So it was a very sketchy neighborhood in terms of personal safety, in terms of any kind of sort of municipal.
Yeah, we're not thinking of it in cultural terms. When I think of New York, of course, in the 70s, one thinks of 2 of the great Scorsese movies,
Sure.
Mean Streets from 73, produced by my friend John Taplin, and then, of course, Taxi Driver from 76. Are these accurate descriptions of the scene or the emergence of a scene that was developing that produced Talking Heads, or are they rather over-romanticized?
I think they're I think they're over-dramatized. I don't know that is the
They're
way I
good,
would
though,
describe
aren't
it.
they?
But I think what's very important about it, what both of those films communicate in one way or another, is the sense of danger that existed in New York at that time, in the street life of New York at that time. A quality that's almost absent in the city now. Again, so much has changed, but I grew up in New York City. I grew up in fairly privileged circumstances on the Upper East Side. Nevertheless, from the time certainly I started to move around the city in the 1960s, for several decades thereafter, one thought about one's personal safety all the time when you were on the street. It was just second nature to be reading the street, to be looking at what was happening around you, not in a paranoid way, but just in a sort of vigilant way. And I think the aura of violence, certainly that Taxi Driver epitomized, and the aura of sort of aggression that Mean Streets, after all, sort of it's right there in the title, epitomized. That was a feature of New York in those days.
It's astonishing how it's changed. I remember when I first went to New York in probably would have been about 82, 83. One was aware, as you say, of the threat of crime. Now I'm there all the time. One never gives it another thought.
Exactly.
So let's get to the heart of the issue. Talking Heads. The title of your book is Burning Down the House. One might have expected, Jonathan, that out of this rather forbidding atmosphere that Mean Streets and Taxi Driver produces, of crime, of drug dens, prostitution, one would have had a band that was, and correct me if I'm wrong, angrier, edgy. I mean, I guess Talking Heads are edgy, but how would you? They've always seemed to me. I'm not an expert, but of course I'm familiar with their work and with the great movie which we'll come to about them. How would you describe their music? It's always been hard for me to categorize. Maybe they're just one of those bands that you can't categorize, which is how you would categorize them.
Well, let's start with this. None of them were New Yorkers, after all. As a native New Yorker, one of the things that I feel strongly about, and that it's also a little bit difficult to admit, most of the extraordinary things that have happened in New York, artistically speaking, culturally speaking, and otherwise for that matter, but we'll just confine ourselves to that, have come not from people who grew up in the city. They've come from people who came to the city. To me, New York is most importantly a destination. It's a place that people from all over the United States, and for that matter, from all over the world, have set their sights on as a place to go. The cliche, of course, is if you can make it there, you can make it anywhere. But the real point is of people from all over wanting to make it there. Not so much because it's more difficult than anywhere else, but because it's more prominent than anywhere else. So in the case of all four Talking Heads who grew up in places like the suburbs of Baltimore, or Pittsburgh, suburbs of Pittsburgh, or the suburbs of Milwaukee, and so on and so forth, they all moved to New York to make a mark, to make a name for themselves in their different ways.
So in that sense, the Dylan movie or the Dylan narrative is being replayed.
It's always being replayed. I mean, it's being replayed as we speak, obviously, by the people that we don't know about yet in that sense. But I think it's a very important dimension of the city. It's not that people who like myself who were born there haven't been inspired to do good things or great things or important things, but the predominance of those people have come from somewhere else. And I think that's an important dimension. So one would not necessarily expect the people in Talking Heads to mirror the sensibility of New York City per se. There were bands that did that. I mean, certainly, one of their closest, briefly contemporaries were the Ramones. Now, the Ramones, came out of Forest Hills, which is a middle-class section of predominantly middle-class section of New York. The Ramones were working-class kids who grew up in that middle-class section, and they were filled with attitude and filled with aggression. I mean, raw aggression as far as that goes. That mirrored the city in a pretty obvious way. I would also say that someone like Bruce Springsteen, for example, who comes onto the scene in a big way the same year that Talking Heads moved to New York. Born to Run comes out in 1975. Springsteen had been around for a while, but his first two albums had not sold particularly well. Born to Run was really his enunciation in a certain sense.
Yeah, it's funny that I was thinking of Springsteen because the way he presents his upbringing in New Jersey, New York was as a foreign, distant place, as distant as it would have been for somebody like David Byrne, who grew up in Canada. Is that fair for somebody?
Well,
so if you weren't from New York, whether you were just over the river in New Jersey, it didn't really make that much difference. It was just another world, another universe.
Well, yes, it was another world, but I think that's part of that sense of distance is part of Springsteen's brilliance as a romanticizer. The truth is that New Jersey is a gigantic suburb of New York, except when it starts becoming a gigantic suburb of Philadelphia, of course, right? At a certain point, halfway through the state. I think people like Springsteen and Patti Smith and so on and so forth, who came from the northern half of New Jersey, they were acutely aware of New York. They came into New York all the time. It wasn't some distant place in that way. But what I was going to say about Springsteen is a lot of his aggression isn't exactly the right term, but there was certainly an aggression in his music that was also representative of that kind of sensibility of New York. Talking Heads were something very different for a lot of different reasons. And part of that had to do with the fact that that not only came from elsewhere, but they were all in very different ways. They were all, for the most part, upper middle class kids. David Byrne had a tendency. David Byrne is Scottish. Was born in Scotland. His parents are Scottish. Scots, of course, are notoriously pecunious. And so David always.
I'm sure you're going to win a lot of Scottish friends from.
Well, no, they are in that sense.
Are they?
Yeah, I think
are they
so.
More, are they more than I don't know, Dutch people?
Well, that could be. But all I was going to say is David always downplayed the economic circumstances of his upbringing.
Who doesn't, Jonathan? We all deny. I grew up with an outside toilet. That's what I tell people. It's not true, of course.
Okay. There we have it. But what I'm saying is they all came from what we would now describe as fairly privileged backgrounds. And what did that mean? That meant that in the United States, and I make a certain distinction of this because of course, there was a long history of the influence of art schools, art colleges on British rock and roll in the 1960s. But in the United States, what that meant was that these were kids who could afford to go to a place like the Rhode Island School of Design, for example, or in Jerry Harrison's case, to Harvard University. And what that meant was these were kids who could choose to pursue careers in art. That's a fairly distinct portion of the population. That's a much smaller demographic.
One of your previous books was about the Beatles. Can't
Sure.
Buy Me Love. In your sort of, I guess, class analysis, would you place the Talking Heads individuals in a different social class from, I don't know, Paul McCartney?
Utterly. Utterly. Especially Paul and George and Ringo.
And not John. He was from more of a middle-class family.
From a lower middle-class background. What in Britain would be regarded as a lower middle-class background. What did that mean? It meant that he lived in a semi-detached house. He grew up in a semi-detached house, not a council house.
So let's get to the musical element here. I mean, I take your point on social class. You mentioned the Ramones, but there isn't, in the birth of punk in England, some of the pioneers of punk were from middle-class families. Two others weren't. So there isn't necessarily a connection between one's socioeconomic circumstance and the nature of the music. But in your view, to get into the heart of Talking Heads, or to get into the head of Talking Heads, do we need to understand social class, Jonathan?
Well, I think what we need to understand is the main point is simply who goes to universities who goes to private universities in the United States, who goes to schools like RISD. And in the United States, that is largely those are largely somewhat privileged people. And I think that is important in a certain way, because it has when we're speaking about Talking Heads, one of the things that we're speaking about, and this is by no means a purely socioeconomic phenomenon, but they were kids who grew up with a sense of ambition. Okay. The way I describe it in the book at one point is actually contrasting them with the Beatles. Nobody ever asked John, Paul, George, and Ringo what they quote unquote wanted to be when they grew up. That was not part of their.
Or for that matter, Otis Redding, your other book.
Exactly right. The members of Talking Heads were the sort of kids who grew up, as was true of me also, who were asked that question all the time. The assumption being that they were going to quote unquote be something, right? They were going to do something distinctive. Whether or not they did that, whether or not any of us went on to do that, was another story. But there was that implication there. And I think that ambition, or that sense of ambition, or that implication of ambition was a part of their approach to their career as musicians from the very, very beginning. These were not people who were wanting to just make it in the music business. These were people who wanted to do something very distinctive.
So how would you compare them? I mean, the people that come to mind here, the British, I mean, they sound in some ways, their background similar to David Bowie or even Mick Jagger and Keith
Yes.
Richard. And then on the American front, the individual I'd be curious as to their relationship and their sensibility towards would be Lou Reed. You mentioned the Ramones. I'm assuming that Reed was from a slightly older generation.
Yes, and in Lou Reed's case, from a much more privileged background than the Ramones. Lou Reed was another one of these kids that I'm talking about. Lou Reed went to Syracuse University. That meant that his parents could afford to send him to Syracuse University. It was, it didn't cost then what it costs now, but it comparatively, it was a similar sort of thing. Lou Reed majored in English in college. That's to say that he didn't go to college in order to get a high-paying technical job here or there or something like that. So yes, I think Lou Reed is an interesting sort of point of comparison. I'm sort of looking forward because I'm doing it. This is not a plug, but when I do readings and things like that, I like to set them up not so much as just readings, but as conversations with people who know something about what I'm trying to talk about. And I'm doing a reading in New York at the Museum of the City of New York this very soon with Anthony DeCurtis, who is a biographer of Lou Reed, and this is one of the things I was really looking forward to talking with Anthony about.
Yeah, my son is a huge fan of. Was a huge. I mean, he has a remarkable legacy, and of course. And we still haven't got into the music. We will get there in a second.
Yeah, sure.
Another individual who comes to mind is Lou Reed's wife, very close associate, Laurie Anderson,
yes,
who also came to New York, also from a fairly privileged background, also intellectually very ambitious.
Yes, and Laurie was a figure in that downtown art scene that Talking Heads in general and David Byrne in particular became a major figure in. Now we're talking more about the 1980s than we are about the 1970s. That is to say, David Byrne, once he became prominent, once the Talking Heads became successful in that sense, he and Laurie Anderson were birds of a feather in that regard.
So okay, so we're circling now. We're going to get into the head. Let's get to the heart of the matter, or the heart as a rather bad joke, heart of the head, into the head of the heads. So these are culturally ambitious, creative, smart, from privileged backgrounds, expected to go somewhere, did indeed get somewhere. You mentioned the Ramones, talked about Lou Reed, Laurie Anderson, Bruce Springsteen, of course. What kind of music did, and this comes back to my question before, what was their genre? How would you describe them?
Well, they started as one thing, and one of the things that I think is so impressive about them is they went on to become many other things. When they started out, they had a very interesting credo that David Byrne put in pretty stark terms. They were much more aware of what they didn't want to be than what they wanted to be, or at least they had a much clearer idea of what they didn't want to be. And some of it had to do with the presentation of rock bands in the mid-1970s. So part of their credo involved no rock hair, no rock lights, no long guitar solos, that sort of thing. But of all of the things that they set out not to be, probably the most dramatic or the most and ultimately ironic was, as David Byrne put it, no singing like a black man. Now, like
your friend Otis Redding, right?
Like my friend Otis Redding. Now, in that statement is something pretty remarkable that we don't really have the time, I don't think, to go into right now. But I started out as a professional musician. I've been listening to and to some extent playing popular music for many years. Before I started playing it, I was listening to it. One of the things I'm acutely aware of is that popular music in Britain and America has never not been about race. From the very beginning, from the time of minstrel shows in the early 19th or mid 19th century, race has been a subtext of popular music. And as I say, that in itself is a huge subject that we don't have the time to sort of tease out now. But for a white musician in 1975 to have one of the sort of credos of the band that he was seeking to put together, to have the credo "No singing like a black man" was a fairly remarkable thing, because
yeah, it's a fascinating observation, Jonathan. And you talk about 1975. 1975 was also the year that Young Americans came out, David Bowie, and of course, sure, that was all about singing like a black man.
Well, yeah, absolutely, of course.
And I guess are they reacting to it, or is all this in parallel?
Well, it's in parallel in the sense that one of the most important aspects of David Byrne's entire creative sensibility, and there are many reasons about for this that of course we can get into the weeds about. David was temperamentally incapable of accepting things at face value. All of the preconceptions that most people tend to have when they set out to do anything artistically, for David, have always been questionable. When I said earlier that there was an agnostic quality to Talking Heads in relation to the religiosity, it wasn't just in relation to the religiosity. In David Byrne's case, he was agnostic about everything. Early Talking Heads songs, one of the main themes of them was the agnostic attitude that they took toward the whole subject of romantic love. Now, I don't have to point out to most people that romantic love is pretty much the principal preconception of popular music. Its centrality, so on and so forth. Most popular music for a very, very long time has taken the subject of love, romantic love, in that sense, as an absolute given. David didn't do that. There've been other great artists in the line of things who came not to do that either. I mean, Dylan in the 1960s invented what many of us regard as the sort of a new genre, which was the anti-love song. Those incredible,
which reached its climax, so to speak, with Blood on the Tracks in 1974.
Well, yeah, but which began with Like a Rolling Stone, which is sort of maybe the greatest sort of anti-love song that anybody ever wrote about somebody that he was romantically involved with. But anyway, Byrne was agnostic about many things, and many
including probably his own agnosticism. You choose to title the book "Burning Down the House," which was a song that Talking Heads released in 1983. Is that also a metaphor for what they were doing? They were perpetually burning the house down.
I think so, in some way or another, as a metaphor.
But they weren't punk hard. They certainly weren't. I mean, compared to the Ramones, they weren't hardcore punk band.
I don't think they were punk in any sense of the word, and I don't think they ever regarded themselves as that. I write in the book that they were with some irony, that they were the albino in the herd of the whole scene at CBGB's. And Tina Weymouth has spoken about the fact that they were never really that accepted there. They were not by any means one of the sort of classic CBGB's bands, even though they went further in many ways than any of the other groups that started there. I suppose you could say that Blondie maybe made more money than they did, but Blondie was a sort of flash in the pan compared to Talking Heads.
Were they, and I know you're going to answer no, but could one argue that they were, so to speak, a flash in the pan? I mean, they made this great movie, they made a few albums, but as you note in an excellent New Yorker piece from a couple of years ago about Talking Heads, they were the classic rock and roll band in the sense they were like the Beatles and the band. They ended that there was a there was a sudden ending. They broke up, and that was it. So could they be accused? Could one argue that they were a little too short term? Certainly in comparison, I don't know, to the Rolling Stones or something, which is obviously the reverse of them.
Well, yeah, I would turn the argument sort of, or the point on its head. And again, I don't shy away from expressing strong opinions about all forms of popular music. That's part of my job. I would say that if the Stones had never made another record after Exile on Main Street, their reputation would have been sealed, and we wouldn't have missed that much in that sense.
I couldn't agree more with you on that one.
So I think the real point is the remarkable thing in the case of the Beatles, who did this under almost unimaginable forms of pressure, or in the case of Talking Heads, or in the case of the band, was that these bands stayed together as long as they did and were as good as they were while they were together. I mean, again, I make no secret of my admiration for the Beatles. To me, Abbey Road is to this day, 70, how many years later, 60 odd years later, it's still the greatest last album in the history of rock and roll, as far as I'm concerned.
And the characters, yeah, I mean, the Beatles, we've all seen the last documentary on them, and the peculiar relationship between McCartney and Lennon, and all the rest of it. When one thinks of Talking Heads, as a generalist myself, one thinks of David Byrne. We don't generally think of the other members. Did Byrne dominate? Was he a troubling figure, rather like the band, which was dominated by individuals, and they were often on rather bad terms with one another? Was Byrne a domineering figure? Was he an unpleasant person to work with?
I don't think he was unpleasant. I think that the way I characterize it in the book, first of all, he was an outsized talent. And that's always problematic in the democratic context or the ostensibly democratic context of a rock and roll band.
And that outsized talent, of course, is not just a metaphor. In the great movie, he was dressed in a
he was
outsized one.
Yes, and that, I think, was a bit of a self-parody of his outsizedness as far as that goes.
This is, of course, Stop Making Sense, which we're going to come to in a second.
I mean, one of the things that people have a tendency to miss about David, especially now, I would say, David has turned into this sort of avuncular character in a certain sense. American Utopia being the sort of the blueprint of that. And in fact, in some of the reviews of American Utopia, I think it was Brent Brantley in the New York Times actually compared Byrne to Mr. Rogers, and Mr. Rogers as this sort of kindly, benevolent figure, and so on and so forth. But the David Byrne of Talking Heads was, first of all, a much edgier figure, and he was a much wittier figure. I mean, a lot of people miss the level of David's wit. And I would say that one of the other aspects of it is David did have certain characteristics that were off-putting as a younger man. But one of the most appealing qualities that when you start interviewing people who knew him back then, some of whom will remind you of the things about him that were off-putting, one of the most appealing qualities about him was his sense of humor. He's always, it's a little odd that he's just released a song called Everybody Laughs, but David has always loved to laugh, has always been focused on the humor in things, sometimes the perverse humor in things.
Well, there's some Scottishness in that. Did you have access to everyone for the book? Did they?
No, I had access to no one. Well, I had access to none of the four principals for the book.
Did you ask to have access, or they chose not to talk to you?
I did indeed, and I went into this with every assumption that they would want to speak with me, and I'll tell you why. First of all, we're the same age. We're exactly of the same generation.
You seem a very gentle fellow there, Jonathan. I can't imagine they were worried that you would destroy them in some way.
No, I don't think it was that. But I think they all had their different reasons, and I think their different reasons are interesting. They say something about them. In David's case, I believe that David is one of his extraordinary qualities are his powers of concentration and focus. David is always focused on whatever it is that David is working on at the current moment. And I think though there are not that many degrees of separation between my world and his, my partner is a painter. She knows she's actually spoken to David about my book and so on and so forth at various events that they happen to be at together. But what I would say is David is just not that interested in talking about the music that he made 30 and 40 years ago. What he's interested in is whatever it is that he's doing right now. That's his focus. So I think ultimately that was the reason that he didn't want to sit down with somebody, as you say, as apparently congenial, and I would hope also musically knowledgeable as myself to talk about that music. Which
he probably was worried you're going to ask him, you were going to borrow some money off him.
Maybe
let's get to the movie. Most people will be most familiar, I think, most generalists will be most familiar with Talking Heads through this remarkable 1984 movie, Stop Making Sense, which is often considered, certainly amongst the best films about popular music, rock and roll music, if that's the right word, ever made. I assume you're a big fan of the film too. Is there something about Talking Heads which is hard to, as we've sort of discovered in this conversation, hard to put your finger on, that somehow comes out in that film, Stop Making Sense?
Yeah, I think that the film is a distillation of their entire sensibility. Many aspects of it. We haven't used the word minimalist yet, but they came up in art school during a period when minimalism, and during a period in the world when minimalism in art was.
So is that also in musical terms?
Yes, I would say that also. There's always been one of the aesthetic qualities that runs through all of their work is a certain sense of less is more, is a certain sense of, in fact, when they were working with Brian Eno, which of course was one of their most...
Another character, obviously, who's part of this scene.
Sure. But one of the techniques that Eno introduced them to was not the normal recording technique of overdubbing additional tracks, but of subtracting tracks that had already been played in order to make room for new developments in the music. It's created a lot of tension in the band in certain cases. Individual band members would arrive at the studio to discover that their part had been removed from what they recorded the day before or the week before, or things like that. But getting back to the film, there is a minimalist aesthetic to Stop Making Sense. There's also a palette, a color palette, or lack thereof, to Stop Making Sense. From the very beginning, Talking Heads, basically one of the very few demands that they made regarding their staging was they didn't perform under colored lights. That might not sound like such a big deal, except that almost every rock group you've ever seen in a theatrical setting has been lit with colored lights, with gels. Talking Heads always performed under various versions of white light. And of course, Stop Making Sense, Jonathan Demme, one of the things that the director of that film, one of the things that he was attracted to was the palette of their performance in that way, the neutrality of it. That's a dominant visual characteristic of the film. And of course, I mean, the film is an apotheosis. It's hard to think of another film that so totally captures the essence of a group. People would point to The Last Waltz in the band, but that was a much more crafty...
Yeah, John Taplin produced that film too.
Sure, exactly. And Martin Scorsese directed it, and that was a much more sort of crafted. It
was a communal film about a community of musicians. Which the band was kind of both the center of, but also the periphery. One of the things that has always struck me about the movie Stop Making Sense is its directness, its intimacy. I'm not sure whether, I assume Demme meant it to be that way, but when you watch it, it's almost as if Byrne is singing directly to whoever happens to be watching. I'm not sure whether Demi brilliantly captured that, or whether that was intentional, or whether it was somehow a reflection of the Talking Heads aesthetic.
I think it was a collaboration between Demi. The film was largely a collaboration between Demi and David Byrne. The other three members of the band at various points felt kind of on the periphery of things, not in their performance, I might add, but in terms of the production of the whole thing. But the important dimension of that is really interesting about the film. And the contrast with the Last Waltz is very strong. They decided from the very beginning that they were going to reject all of the conventions of the rock performance film, which in a satiric way begins with A Hard Day's Night, but then gets very serious with films like Monterey Pop and Woodstock and so on and so forth. The point being that there are no audience shots until the very, very end of Stop Making Sense. The film is not a film of a concert. It's a film of a performance. The fact that an audience happens to be there, the fact that it happens to be taking place in a theater, you never see the theater. If this was The Last Waltz, you would have seen people arriving at the theater. There would be backstage interviews. There would be interviews with the producers and all of this sort of thing, and with fans. There's none of that. It simply is a document, a visual document of the performance, perfectly crafted.
And as you say about Byrne, it reflected his own particular focus, and we're focusing in the film on him. And you think of Monterey Pop, of course, it began with the interviews with the fans, or
Sure.
The Pennebaker movie about Dylan is really more about the fans than it is about Dylan himself.
Yeah. So as I say, they rejected all of that. One of the things I love about it, though, about the timing of the film, which they had no way of knowing, which was that during the period that they were making that film or working on the post-production of that film, Rob Reiner was preparing to release This Is Spinal Tap. And of course, This Is Spinal Tap is the film that laid to rest all the conventions of the classic rock documentary.
And mocks big band,
mocks it all, mocks the whole form of presentation in that way. You know, the ultimate backstage.
There's so much here, Jonathan. We got to end in a few minutes. I know you're busy as well, but talking about the fans, did they have? I mean, they obviously had fans. You're a fan, but did they have a hardcore following?
Yes, and it was an especially hardcore following. I mean, Talking Heads were what we would normally describe as a cult band until really two things. Until Speaking in Tongues, which was their first big sort of album. I named the book after Burning Down the House because that was their first top 10 single. And that was the point at which they started to become a really viable commercial act. In that sense. And then, of course, Stop Making Sense sort of sealed the deal on all of that. So I would say for the first 5 or 6 years of their existence, they were a very popular cult band, but they were also capable of complaining. As Jerry Harrison once said, I wish we were a little less famous and a little more successful, meaning he wished more people bought their records. But Stop Making Sense was indeed a gold record, and then a platinum record, and so on and so forth. And most of their work after that fell into that category. So yes, they had, or they gained, rather, is a better way to put it, a very large following, and it was an extremely devoted following. Most people regarded them as unlike anything else. For most people, they were sui generis. For most people, they were in a class of their own in that sense. And I think there's some truth to that in that way.
Couple more questions, Jonathan. Chuck Klosterman, of course, wrote The 90s, which presents an entirely different decade. You note in your New Yorker piece that the band came to maybe an early end, or maybe not, but an appropriately early end. Did the cultural tide, the zeitgeist, shift against Talking Heads by the 90s? Is that the appropriate bookend for
I think
their influence?
I think there was some of that, but I think there was also just simply a certain sense of creative exhaustion. And this is the other dimension of this band that we haven't talked about all that much, because it contrasts with the romanticized view of what a rock group is. Many of the English bands, beginning with the Beatles, began as groups of mates. They began as groups of adolescents, and of course in England that term has a particular resonance to it. Wherever anybody winds up, very often males particularly, or women too, they have an equivalent. These adolescent bonding that goes on has a profound effect. Talking Heads weren't that. These were not people who began as close friends, who came up together in a non-musical context or something like that.
And there was a woman in it as well, which
absolutely, and she was two of the members were romantically linked as far as that went. So that also created a whole other dynamic, I guess is the best way to describe it, in all of that. But so I think that the interpersonal relationships became increasingly strained, particularly as David Byrne's prominence became greater and greater and greater. The other three members began to feel like second, third, and fourth wheels.
So is that the equivalent would be, was his name Robbie Robertson and the band?
Yes, in a certain way. But you know, the difference there, and it's an important difference, is that Robertson was dependent on three of the greatest singers in rock and roll who happened to be in his group to put that music across. Byrne wasn't dependent in the same way on the other members of Talking Heads to simply make this whole thing happen. And so Robertson's position was sort of similar, but everybody, the face of the band was not Robbie Robertson. The face of the band, after all, was Levon and Rick and Richard. So it was a different kind of dynamic in that sense. But the other part of it with David was his interest just expanded beyond the notion of simply playing in a rock and roll band. I mean, the principal sort of drama around the group after Stop Making Sense was, would they ever tour again? And David kept saying the same thing, which was that as soon as we can do this whole thing in a completely new way, rather than just replicating what we did so well and documented and Stop Making Sense, we'll tour again, but not until then. Well, you know, the economics of playing in a band are a little different from that. And have only become more so as recording as a source of income has sort of faded, and live performance has become the lifeblood of the music business once again.
And you can go and see the film anyway, Stop Making Sense, which is better than anything they can produce. Finally, Jonathan, there's a piece in the New York Post featuring some of your work earlier this month, and it's entitled "Why the Talking Heads Are Still Making More Sense Than Ever 50 Years Later." Why does Talking Heads matter in June 2025? You've just written this biography of the band, Burning Down the House. Why should we care today in June 2025?
So 40 years later, 50 years later, we still have this phenomenon of the rock group. That was something that was invented in the early 1960s, but it's still I won't say certainly doesn't dominate popular music, but it's still an organizational musical principle that's with us. Talking Heads were the paradigm of what we now think of as the alternative rock group. That is to say, a band that's mainly concerned with its aesthetic output, not its commercial output, and a band where there's some expectation that there'll be an evolution, a musical evolution in what they do from year to year, And as I say, to me, they remain to this day the archetype of that. There've been plenty of bands since then that in one way or another have been regarded as fulfilling that role. REM was one. Some people will say Nirvana was one. Everybody has their favorite groups, but not on the superstar level, because that's a different sort of thing. But on the fundamental level, they remain the archetype. Now, the one other thing I'll say about them, and I think people who were able to see the film when it was re-released last year may share this impression, because to me it was the most notable thing about the film.
And the film, by the way, for our audience, it's important to underline, this has to be seen in a cinema, not at home.
Yes,
not allowed. You're not allowed to watch it on your television.
But
you have to go to a theater.
Yes, but the thing about it is, there's nothing anachronistic about it. There's nothing about it that screams 1980, 84. The way the people look, the way the band sounds, the whole level of presentation could be happening now. Oddly enough, the only slightly anachronistic thing is at the beginning of sort of the second set, or the second half of it, there are those Ed Ruscha style word paintings where these random words are sort of put up behind the band. That's very 80s. But everything else about them, and I mean this in terms of the way people dress, the way their hair is cut, and the way they're conducting themselves, is utterly modern. And it stays that way. This was a band that was devoted to the notion of modernity in some sense, and it's worn.
Although the term, and I never know what this term means, the word postmodern is associated with them. Is that an inaccuracy? Yeah,
I would say it is, because postmodernism, I think, creates a false relationship with what came immediately before. I know that term's been used about them. I don't think it resonates very in an interesting way in their case. I don't think it applies.
So, Jonathan, should people watch the movie or read your book if they can only do one of one thing? Read the book or the movie?
I would say this: since so many of them may have seen the movie already, I'd suggest they might want to read the book.
Yeah, read the book first, then the movie. Burning Down the House, Talking Heads and the New York Scene That Transformed Rock. Fascinating book. Wonderful conversation, Jonathan. And best of luck with the book and with all the stuff you're doing. I know you're talking to Seth Rogovoy in New York, upstate New York in August. People should go to that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew. It's been a pleasure being here.